really honored to be here. I'm honored to have been invited to speak because it is librarians who make my work possible. And to speak on behalf of Readex, whose materials make my work so much easier. And whose mission, I think, aligns with mine. I often say that my goal is to make history matter more to more people. And there's nothing, I think, that can make history matter more to more people than allowing more people to have access to and engagement with the primary sources upon which histories are composed and interpretations are drawn. And so it is really wonderful to be here. As Lars said in his introduction, I really see as my mission bridging what has become, I think, too large a divide between, quote, academic history and public history. And I think Readex's work helps to actually bridge that divide in important ways. My other starting point for this talk today is textbooks, American history textbooks, and how they relate the history of American Indians in general and their relations with American pioneers in particular. In terms of the history of their coverage of American Indians, textbooks have certainly in recent years added substantially to their coverage of American Indians. And yet the maps that we use to illustrate those histories, maps such as this one, which is a standard sort of textbook map presentation of the westward expansion of the United States, showing the sort of different moments in which the United States acquired different pieces of its turf, and then the state boundaries neatly drawn in with their dates of entrance into the Union. Or more specifically, for example, the ones we use to employ, looking more closely, the ones we use to employ the Louisiana Purchase territory, Louisiana Territory. Maps, again, like this one. As opposed to maps like, got to do it this way, as opposed to maps like this one. The former, suggesting an empty virgin land awaiting occupation by American pioneers. The other, recognizing a peopled landscape with territorial boundaries already placed onto the land. The maps, of course, which erase it, create the illusion, create the mishistory of a world of, or to use the phrase that 19th century Americans would have employed, a virgin land, an empty land, and one also in which the history, especially like a map like this one, the history seems to be manifestly destined, again, to borrow a phrase from 19th century American history, in which it sort of unfolds this way as if it's the only way it could have unfolded. When it comes to telling the history of Indians and pioneers, our textbooks still typically tell a relatively simple and monotonous story. Distilled down, it begins with competition over land, add to that mix a sort of implacable hatred between peoples. The result is unremitting hostility. On successive frontiers, then, that story repeats itself. Pulled together, the territorial history of the United States is then replete with blood-shattering, world-shattering, people-scattering conflicts. So too in our popular culture have tales of unrelenting, dark and bloody grounds dominated our imaginings about the frontiers where Indians and Americans intersected. By contrast, my talk today and the broader project from which it derives exposes what I call an alternative history in which Americans and Indians found common ground, at least for a time. In particular, my presentation examines the hospitable relations that unexpectedly characterized relations between Indian and American migrants from the Ohio Valley to the Louisiana Territory. Oh, I'm moving things along here too quickly. Let me go back this way. From the Ohio Valley, oh wait, sorry, we'll get back. from the Ohio Valley to the Louisiana Territory. In the years immediately before, during, and after the American Revolution, these peoples, these American pioneers and Indians in the Ohio Valley, battled and belittled one another as they sought occupation and opportunity in that region. Yet when both these peoples moved to the Louisiana Territory in the late 1790s and first decade of the 19th century at least, amity replaced enmity into what was then a formerly French and now a Spanish colony. And I'm interested in how that happened and what became of it. Drawing on Spanish colonial records and the Territorial Papers of the United States, I explore how former enemies, the most celebrated of whom was Daniel Boone, the figure on the left, cordially cohabited during the 1790s with Indians with whom they had formerly been at war. How generally friendly associations were maintained after the Louisiana Purchase transferred the territory to the United States. Yet in the decade after the War of 1812, peaceful interactions gave way to pressure from a new set of settlers. Increasingly, the demands of American pioneers, or the demands, I should say, of American democracy, pushed territorial authorities, the most notable of whom was William Clark, the figure on the right, to evict Indians from the eastern portion of the Louisiana Territory. At first, Clark resisted this pressure, but in the 1820s and 1830s, he ended up overseeing the removals of Indians to and from the Louisiana Territory. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the project, or as Aron mentioned in the introduction, the project is part of a larger history, and a larger alternative history I'm working on, with the working title, Can We All Get Along? An Alternative History of the American West. And that quote that makes up the title, of course, traces back to the moment in May of 1992, and we have a couple of people from California, at least, who remember this, during the height of the Los Angeles riots in the spring of 1992, when Rodney King, the African-American who had been beaten by the police and then whose subsequent acquittal of the police at the trial led to the rioting. And then during this outburst of violence, Rodney King, in a tearful way, got up in front of a battery of TV cameras and sort of exclaimed, pled, can we get along, people, can we all just get along? Now, I think viewed from that moment, in which Los Angeles was ablaze, in which peoples who had originally hailed from the southern part of the United States were battling and fighting with peoples who had came to the United States from points from East Asia or from points south of the United States. Judged in that moment, certainly it appeared that the answer to Rodney King's query, can we all get along, would be an emphatic no. And indeed, viewed against the larger stream of American Western history, the history of the American frontier and the history of the American West, so too would it seem that the answer to Rodney King's query would be no. That fact, that inhabitants of the American West, the diverse peoples of the American West, have long been at odds and often at war with one another, that fact is one that Western historians have long acknowledged. What has changed in the interpretation in recent decades, is how we historians interpret that violence. What was once acclaimed for manifesting American destiny is now more often decried as the dirty underside of American expansion, of American history. Now, in my project, I'm not interested in whitewashing, in romanticizing, in apologizing for conquest and the expropriation of Indian lands. In pursuing an alternative history of the American West, I'm not looking for paradises lost. Rather, I aim to surface possibilities in the past. That is, I'm seeking out times and places where cohabitants of the American West, often against their own prior experiences and histories, got along with one another. I hope my alternative history illuminates episodes in which collisions led to collusions, and in which erstwhile enemies reconciled, if often only temporarily. I suppose before I go a little further down this trail, I should explain a little bit about what I mean by these terms. If you Google, I've been using the phrase alternative history, if you Google that phrase, you're automatically taken to alternate history. And when you go into, dig into alternate histories, you quickly find yourself in what I call a sort of Twilight Zone experience. Alternate histories are kind of histories based on a kind of what if. It's a genre that I think the booksellers in the exhibition hall know well. It's one that has an enormous popular audience, the Twilight Zone being the TV version of it often, but the what if, how many of you are familiar with sort of like the man in the high castle? You know, so that's what if, that's a what if. But if you actually go down further, and there are thousands and thousands of books written in this genre, what if history, in which something gets changed and then historical outcomes get altered, you probably can guess what the two most popular subjects of alternate history are. So one is World War II, is what if the Nazis had won the Second World War, and the other is the Civil War, and what if the South had won the Civil War, is the other big one. I'm not adding to that genre, which at least among professional historians has a pretty poor reputation. I'm not interested in altering facts, nor for that matter am I interested in alternative facts. The alternative history I pursue happened. It requires no, what fancy historians sometimes refer to as counterfactual speculations to set in motion. The chapters that comprise my alternative history's table of contents each focus on a particular time and place in which various intercultural accommodations and political arrangements occurred which permitted people to get along. Geographically, the sites on which I focus stretch across American Wests, from the Ohio Valley to the Pacific Ocean. Chronologically, the chapters take my alternative history from the American Revolution to the present. Together, they provide a range of situations in which common ground was found. Now, I should add here that I have benefited immensely in this project from the databases that Readex provides, especially, well, actually the Territorial Papers I'm waiting for, but the newspapers have been quite helpful to me as I've conducted my research. I can just remember in the past, before these databases were so easily accessible, spending years and many dollars finding newspapers that are now just a click away. Or for example, this summer when I'm planning on conducting research for a chapter about Dodge City, Kansas, which initially would have involved, or some time ago would have involved my spending months in western Kansas. Not that I have anything against spending months in western Kansas in July and August, where the heat and humidity is, well, the heat anyway, not the humidity, is something akin to New Orleans. Anyway, back to my alternative history. Which often, as I say, episodes in which common ground was found and lost. Found and lost. That qualifier is necessary to distinguish my version of alternative history from what I refer to as wishtory. In the cases I have chosen, accommodations were tenuous. Concord could be heralded, but it rarely held. By contrast, wishtory, which I define as the history we wish for, often omits the breakdown. That preserves the illusions of happily ever after history. History, I would argue, deserves serious contemplation. These myths tell us much about our shifting hopes and our shifting dreams. But history fakes history by retouching realities, flattening complexities, and erasing unpleasant aftermaths. Its lessons are not the ones which I wish to gain from an alternative history of the American West. Now, the preference for what I would call inverted alternate histories and historical fantasies has become more prominent in our popular culture. Not that long ago, as I mentioned, a blood-soaked history served triumphant purposes. Warfare secured the manifest destiny of the United States. Of late, though, our popular culture has often overturned those perspectives. I used to explain this inversion to my students by sort of speaking about the shift in cinema from what I called the John Wayne version of Western history to the Dances with Wolves version of Western history. And I kept doing that until I would sort of look out increasingly into my sort of students and sort of see that none of them had really any familiarity. None of them had ever seen a John Wayne movie. So that was already a sort of foreign touchstone for them. But actually what was more painful to me, because it reflects the ages, it reflects the years going by, is that none of them had any idea what Dances with Wolves was either. That most of them were not born when Dances with Wolves came out in 1991. Nonetheless, I still think, perhaps for some people in this room, for some of you in this room, this sort of recognition from John Wayne to Dances with Wolves, or what I call from the feel-good version of Western history, the sort of triumphalist version of Western history that John Wayne's Westerns exemplified, to the feel-guilty version of a Paradise Lost story, the inverted history that Dances with Wolves presents, sort of does serve to suggest something about how our perspectives have shifted. From a feel-good to a feel-guilty myth. The other way in which I think, just sort of quizzing my students about what sort of is in their minds about this history and trying to get at what they come to it with. The other way that's become clear to me is when I used to ask my students to sort of name or to speak about who is the iconic Indian figure. What name or figure first comes to mind? Almost always the response I would get back would be some version of the Plains Indian warrior in headdress, often on horseback, and then in terms of names, it would usually be Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Geronimo. For those from further points back east, maybe Tecumseh would fit in that. By contrast, again, over the last 10 or 15 years in particular, that has shifted. And the ones that come back almost always are Pocahontas, as imagined by Disney's Imagineers, and Sacagawea as drawn by the United States Postal Service. What's fascinating to me, again, is, and I can't claim to have answers to it, but it's a sort of fascinating question to ask about why that shift in the way students come to this question. And again, not what it tells us about our history, but what it tells us about our wishtories. That is why, when you think about it, the shift from where you had these figures who were male and who were sort of celebrated or venerated for their militant military resistance, their last stands against American expansions that they led, as opposed to the Pocahontas story, especially as it's been Disneyfied, or the Sacagawea story, or Sacagawea story, as it was especially played out during the bicentennial commemorations a decade ago of the Lewis and Clark expedition. In both cases, we get now females instead of males. We get, actually women, we get girls, not women, they're teenagers when they enter the sort of these stories. And we get women who are, or girls who are famous for brokering intercultural accommodations, for marrying European men, for bearing interracial offspring, and for giving us a kind of kinder, gentler frontier origin story for our histories, or for our wishtories at least. Again, we can take up in the Q&A afterwards what we make of that transition about ourselves, what we make about ourselves from that. About our yearning for a foundation myth for American westward expansion, a wishtory that begins not on dark and bloody ground, but on a landscape of peace, love, and understanding. What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? Which brings me, okay, that was a long-winded introduction, which brings me to, back to the particular focus of today's talk, the alternative history of the Louisiana Territory, or more specifically, the piece of the United States purchased from France that subsequently was designated within the Louisiana Territory as the Missouri Territory and ultimately became the state of Missouri. That's a terrain that I explored in a different way, or that occupied my attention a decade ago in one of the books that Alar mentioned, American Confluence, whose title referred to the region's defining feature, which was the confluence of the continent's major rivers, in particular the Ohio and the Missouri rivers joining the Mississippi River. And it was, both as a geographic designation and a metaphor, it seemed to me, an explanation for the area where the rivers came together was also the area where peoples came together, and where histories flowed together, where histories were decisively shaped by the meeting of rivers, and which in turn, as I said, turned it into a meeting point of peoples. Historically, those confluences made it a place where empires, nations, peoples, and cultures came together. Though in the 19th century, it also became the place at which the United States almost came apart. I should say, again, that American Confluence could not have been written without the Territorial Papers of the United States. Much of it is based on those records. So I'm really quite excited to see those records coming out now, or shortly coming out from Readex. And more important, what we have is just such a tiny fraction in those published volumes. What's going to really transform the world here is that the published volumes of the Territorial Papers really, as I understand now, will encompass just a tiny fraction of what the Readex database will eventually encompass. And that's just going to be transformative in terms of the research opportunities that we will be able to take on in terms of territorial histories of the United States. In the last half of the 18th century, in the last half of the 18th century, the center of the Confluence region was home to shifting and overlapping colonial regimes. On the east side of the Mississippi River, you had a territory that went from France to Great Britain to the United States. On the west side, that portion which was later designated as Louisiana Territory, it passed from France to Spain, then briefly back to France, before landing in the United States in 1803. And again, going back to my earlier point about maps, though, imperial maps, the maps which we typically still use in our textbooks, imperial maps, though, bore little relationship to the actual situation on the ground. Through the 18th century and into the 19th century, most of the Confluence region and all but tiny enclaves of the Louisiana Territory was, contrary to the way the maps present it, was Indian country, home to a variety of native peoples whose longtime inhabitants were joined by more recent immigrants over the course of the last decades of the 18th century. I'm going to pick up the story today in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, which is really a bad name for a war that lasted more than 7 years. But it's a better name than the other one that we still use, which is the French and Indian War, which is even less apt as a description of the actual conflict, of the actual global conflict. One result of which was that Spain acquired France's claim to the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi River, while England took over most of that domain on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. Spain, however, struggled to make its new colony Spanish in anything but on its own wishful maps. Recognizing the tenuousness of their hold over over the territory, Spain sort of tried to figure out ways to sort of make the territory more Spanish. One thing they first did is they tried to figure out ways to get Catholics from Europe to migrate to this part of the world. But very few took up that invitation. The next scheme that the Spanish colonial authorities arrived at was to seek out Indian migrants. And there they found a willing group, or a willing group of refugees from the Ohio Valley, people in the 1780s and early 1790s who were being displaced by American pioneers in the Ohio Valley and sought a refuge from those they claimed to the Spanish were their cruelest enemies, who, like a plague of locusts, were inhabiting the territories of the Ohio, along the Ohio River, and were pushing them out. And so these Indians, primarily Shawnees and Delawares, but also Cherokees, in considerable numbers accepted the Spanish invitation and migrated across the Mississippi River migrated out of the United States and into Spanish territory west of the Mississippi River. The next decision, though, was somewhat, and there they sort of established a Granada. These maps didn't sort of turn out well on this. They're color in my version. Anyway, the Spanish give them a land grant, 750 square mile land grant, but just north of Cape Girardeau, along Apple Creek in what is today southeastern Missouri. And they settled there. Some 1,200 Shawnees and 600 Delawares established villages in that area that I've designated the Spanish land grant. Now, even though as the Spanish welcomed the added numbers and security that the emigrant Indians brought to Upper Louisiana, their imperial and immigrant policy took a paradoxical turn. Seeking even more migrants to sort of create a larger settler population, a buffer population against Indians to the west in particular, who the Spanish felt threatened by, the Spanish then began to invite in American immigrants as well, especially those who had lost their lands in the Ohio Valley. And the most celebrated of these newcomers was Daniel Boone, who accepts the invitation from the Spanish government and relocates across the Mississippi River and takes up lands in what is then the Spanish Louisiana Territory near St. Louis. What's so strange and paradoxical about this policy is that on the one hand, the Spanish are expressing in their colonial papers deep reservations about the threats that aggressive American immigration poses to them. And yet they're seeking to invite in Americans to guard against Americans, which in the scheme of things looks like a pretty foolish policy. And it's one actually a generation later that the Mexican government, in a sense, repeats inviting Americans in to Texas. And very quickly, those Americans become the dominant population in Texas. By 1830s, outnumber Mexicans in Texas by 9-1. And I think most of us know what happens in that history. And so on the one hand, again, because historians know how things turned out, we could say, whose bright idea was it to invite Americans in to protect against Americans? And yet, at the time, the policy did not seem so foolish. In fact, there was a really good example, not to the north, of what the British had done in Upper Canada, what is today Ontario, where the British had also invited in large numbers of Americans. These are not the loyalist refugees after the American Revolution. These are Americans who are seeking land on whatever best terms they can get, who find their opportunity moving north across the Niagara River and north of the Great Lakes and settle among the British. Now, when the United States launches the War of 1812 and invades Canada during the War of 1812, the United States is very confident that this will result in the American settlers who make up the majority of the population will quickly turn on the British and rejoin the United States, and this will pave the way for the success of the United States, which of course is why Canada is today part of the United States. That's an alternate history, not an alternative history. That's not what turns out to happen. And indeed for the Spanish too, the Spanish find that the American newcomers who they attract are quite contented for the most part to live in Spanish territory, so long as the Spanish, like what the British had done in Upper Canada, are basically willing to leave them alone We all know that the American Revolution's catchphrase was no taxation without representation. The British in Upper Canada are no more willing to give representation in Parliament to the settlers in Upper Canada than they had been in the United States, but they're also not interested in taxing them. They learned one thing from the American Revolution, that Americans, if you don't tax them, if you give them land on relatively cheap terms, and if you sort of keep the peace with Indians, that's a pretty good recipe for making things work. And the Spanish sort of are also doing that pretty successfully in the 1790s. The problem is that experiment gets aborted because the Spanish end up selling the territory back to the French in 1800, and then the French sell it to the United States. But that's to get ahead of the story. The story here is that, remarkably enough, in the 1790s, people like Daniel Boone, who really, by the time he got to Missouri, or Louisiana, again, I don't want to sort of suggest that people in this room remember Daniel Boone looking like this, as Fess Parker, interchangeable with Daniel Boone's, or with Fess Parker's Davy Crockett. Daniel Boone, by the way, never wore a coonskin cap. If you take one thing away from this presentation, remember that. Daniel Boone actually, he wore a beaver skin hat. At any rate, he actually looked more like this because he was about 60 years old by the time he got to Spanish Louisiana. But he, with these people with whom he had been engaged in horrific terrorist violence and warfare through the 1770s and 1780s, Daniel Boone lives quite happily and peacefully among the Shawnee Indians in the area through the 1790s. And Boone, in many ways, is, you know, his earlier life, as I said, he had lost a son during his first settlement attempt to settle Kentucky in 1773. He had lost another son in a battle against Shawnee Indians in 1782. He himself had been taken captive by the Shawnees in 1778, which is another story in my alternative history. In any case, he had good reason to engage in the kind of deep enmity, the Indian hating that we think of as being the norm on dark and bloody American frontiers. And yet Daniel Boone moved to Missouri, settling nearby to these Indians, and he, like most of the other American immigrants in the territory, got along quite easily with those Indians in Spanish territory through the late 70s, 80s, and 1790s, joining together to hunt, to engage in dancing, merriment, gambling, in all sorts of ways. This was sort of, you know, these were people getting along. And Boone in some ways was exceptional, but it was, as I say, the rule through the 1790s in this territory. Common ground was found, in part based on real common cultures that had developed in frontiers. One of the things that most fascinates me about the history of frontiers is the way in which the bleeding of ways, the crossing of ways, works across these zones of interpenetration. Rather than thinking of frontiers as stark lines or divides, frontiers are really borderland areas, places in which peoples meet and mingle, often violently, if they're competing for things. But what also emerges is syncretic cultural elements, people borrowing from and sometimes in fear of one another. And out of that commonality and compatibility, it seemed to me, emerges the possibility, realized for a time in Spanish Louisiana, for erstwhile enemies to get along with one another. Common ground was found. And I would, if I had more time, go into more detail about the ways in which this common ground was found, the ways in which syncretic or common cultural elements developed, the ways in which people borrowed from one another, the ways in which Indians adapted from Euro-American neighbors, the ways in which Euro-American frontier pioneers borrowed from Indian ways, the ways in which material cultures blurred to such an extent that archaeological evidence in some of these places makes it hard to distinguish what were Indian settlements versus what were Euro-American settlements in this area of Spanish Louisiana. We can talk more about that if you have specific questions about how that worked. Here, what I would say is it's really what I think is a remarkable example of reconciliation. Shawnees and their American neighbors, people who a decade earlier had been locked in a death struggle for control of the Ohio Valley, now joined together in all sorts of social activities, and joined together to fight a common foe. And this is a point I'll come back to later, in this case, the Osage Indians. But more than this, I think they came together economically, socially, and sexually, their mixed offspring further cementing the common cultures and compatible cultures that bound these former enemies to one another. Common ground was found. And yet, and this is also part of the story, common ground was lost. Alas, concord proved relatively short-lived. Within a few years of the Louisiana Purchase, intercultural tensions around Apple Creek, around that Cape Girardeau area, around that Spanish land grant area, were on the rise as newcomers poured into the area. In 1808, William Clark negotiated a treaty with the Osage Indians that compelled that nation to cede a large portion of its territory in what is now western Missouri, removing one of the external threats that the Shawnee, Delaware, and American pioneers had joined together to fight. That diminished their threat. With the common enemy reduced, and with Americans crossing the Mississippi River now into American territory, into United States territory, in greater numbers, common cultures became not a source of relief, but more of friction. Related appeals, or repeated appeals, I should say, from Shawnees to territorial officials to take actions against squatters occupying their lands, led now Governor Meriwether Lewis, after the Lewis and Clark expedition. Meriwether Lewis is made the governor, that's his reward, made the governor of the Louisiana Territory, led Governor Lewis in April 1809 to order all intruders within 5 miles of those Indian lands and towns to depart immediately. Lewis commits suicide in 1809. Later, during the War of 1812, William Clark, on the right here, William Clark becomes he had been the sort of leading official in terms of Indian affairs. He becomes the territorial governor. And he too sort of is confronted with the problem of what to do with Americans now moving unchecked across the Mississippi River and expanding and occupying Indian lands on the other side of the river, squatting on lands and claimed by Indian inhabitants. As governor of the territory in the years after the War of 1812, William Clark tried, as Meriwether Lewis had done, to defend Indian clan claims. In December 1815, he issued a proclamation against the continuing encroachments of squatters on the lands of Shawnee Indians and Delaware Indians. But Clark, and this is something you see really in the Territorial Papers, Clark can issue this edict, but Clark has really no way to enforce the edict against a rising Democratic tide that really has no interest in seeing that edict enforced. Shawnees and Delawares, for their part, did not embrace this, or I should say, Shawnees and Delawares continued to vigorously resist. Their petitions show up again and again in the Territorial Papers, saying, wait a second, these lands are ours. What have we done to be deserving of being expelled from these lands? And Clark, as I say, is sympathetic. Even though the territorial legislature, and this is a key difference, in the territorial period, the governorship is appointed by the president. The territorial legislator, as the territories graduate to higher stages of population and higher stages, the territorial legislature is democratically elected by the white citizens of the area, and their demands, the demands of land-hungry Americans, are basically saying, yes, what you need to do is remove the Indians, get them out of this territory. Clark resists that. He issues his proclamation. Clark entertains the petitions of Shawnee and Delawares, who basically say, look, we're doing everything, and this is a story you're sort of familiar with from the Cherokee story that Dan Feller told, for those of you who were here at that presentation. They're doing basically what had been asked of them. They've learned to read. They're creating a beginnings of a written language. They are living at peace and friendship with their American neighbors. They are now becoming increasingly cattle raisers. They're sort of their farming looks very much like their American neighbors. There are still very important differences, but what record is there of enmity here? Clark, as I say, as the highest territorial official, does initially try to protect those Indian rights, but increasingly his defenses run against the territorial legislature's demands for quick removal of those Indians. And where the gap between Indian rights and majority will or majority rule come into sharpest focus is when Missouri is becoming a state. When the Louisiana Territory is being carved up and Missouri becomes eligible for statehood. Now, most of the time, again, in our textbooks, the way the Missouri crisis plays out is this, the effort by Missouri, the bid for statehood by Missouri triggers the crisis about slavery and the expansion of slavery. Would Missouri be admitted as a slave state or as a free state, or how would that change the balance between slave states and free states? The untold story, in some ways, is what happens to Indians as a result of the statehood and the ways in which that plays out in terms of democratic rights. But here, Clark thinks, look, I'm the most prominent person in the territory. I'm the hero of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I've been the governor. So he agrees in that sort of 18th century fashion to, quote, stand for election. Stand for election. His opponents, though, moving into the new political world to come, are running for election, are campaigning. And one of their campaigns is basically Clark is too good to the Indians. And what's more, they whisper that Clark has fathered a child by Indians, by an Indian woman, which again, in the earlier period, would have been true of almost every leading official in Spanish or French colonial Louisiana, and of many of that earlier generation of American pioneers too, especially those engaged in the fur trade. By the 1820s, though, suddenly that had become no longer respectable among the new class of pioneers moving into the territory. Clark fully expects to win an overwhelming victory. In fact, on election day, Clark is defeated by a better than 2-to-1 margin, which it seems to me signals the ways in which democracy undermines the sort of common ground that had once existed. In the 1820, at the time of Missouri's entrance to statehood, nearly 1,400 Shawnees still lived on Apple Creek and along the nearby rivers. For a time, at places further inland, Shawnee and Delaware Indians continued to live amicably among American neighbors in more sparsely settled districts up in the Ozarks. But in the more fertile and more desired lowland territories closer to the Mississippi River, the pressure on Indians to be removed becomes inexorable. By 1825, Clark himself, having lost the governorship but being now assigned to be the chief, basically the head of Indian affairs, again, west of the Mississippi River, the chief agent, he ultimately comes to oversee the removal of Indians by a treaty in November of 1825 in exchange for relinquishing their land grants around Apple Creek. The Shawnees agree to receive $14,000 from the United States government and a tract near the junction of the Kansas and Missouri River west of what is now the state of Missouri. It took another 4 or so years for the government to organize the exodus of the Shawnees. When it finally happened in 1830, the government, and this is a familiar story, failed to provide many of the promised supplies, which increased the hardship of the journey and made the first seasons in their new homes in what is today Kansas much tougher. Even then, some Shawnees and Delawares lingered on, continued, as they said, to loiter and occupy the country, according to the governor of Missouri in 1830s. During the 1830s, though, Apple Creek lost its remaining Indians and became exclusively, really the territory of Missouri, the state of Missouri now, became exclusively an American settlement. Over time, memories of the area's legacy of concord faded. Evidence that Shawnee and Delaware Indians and Americans had once gotten along became hidden from view. In fact, the only historical marker now, you can't find Apple Creek, you can't find the Indian settlements, there's no marker. The only historical marker in the area is this one, which stakes out the route of the Trail of Tears, the Cherokees' Trail of Tears through the state of Missouri. A history, obviously, which is quite opposite to the alternative one that I'm seeking to recover or uncover. But recovering that alternative history reminds us of possibilities lost and raises questions about the conditions that promoted concord and those that undermined it. What happened at Apple Creek, what happened in southeastern Missouri, was not unique in the 18th century. In the interior of North America, one can find many other places where the presence of an external threat, the play of imperial rivalries, and the production of common and compatible cultures encouraged accommodations between peoples. To be sure, violence was hardly absent from these border zones. If borderlands such as these bred accommodations, they also, with little notice, bled when trading turned to raiding, or when one party or another sensed the slightest tip in the balance of power that kept things sort of otherwise in check. Very often, too, the violence was simply displaced against another group. That is, Group A and Group B managed to get along in order to, screw over Group C. So it's sort of just a case of displaced violence. These are not necessarily what I would call, or what I think get romanticized in histories as what I call kumbaya stories. That's not what I'm after. Still, the multipolar contest that characterized the interior of North America in the 18th century and into the early 19th century did sustain conciliations that do provide a stark contrast, especially with what I think followed the War of 1812 in those places. Gone after the War of 1812 were rough balances of power that contained unilateral exercises of domination, constrained expansionist endeavors, conditioned polities for compromise, and invited peoples into cultural borrowings. Although this shared world came apart in the early 19th century, its existence merits excavation and explanation. The presence over several decades of alternative arrangements, of inclusive relations that defied for a time what we assume to be an inexorable trend toward exclusive occupations, pushes us not to conjure cuddly, Disney-esque fantasies, but instead to understand the conditions that encouraged and sustained conciliation. In turn, that should force us to elucidate why these peaceful convergences unraveled, and not simply assume that they should. From that history of this corner of the Louisiana Territory, we could deduce that Western white Americans got along with Indians when they had no better options. One can point to similar situations in which outnumbered Americans fashioned expedient alliances. Rather than averting violence, these arrangements sometimes just displaced it or merely delayed it. That summation, though, is too one-sided, too limited, too pessimistic. Yes, the history of the American West is replete with examples of white Americans using Indians. But the example that I've just told in other episodes in my alternative history reveal plenty of instances in which Indians used Americans. Yes, the adaptations made by Daniel Boone and other early American pioneers into the Louisiana Territory did not signify full or enduring conversions to Indian ways. But that is generally actually how convergences worked. Minglings produced slight fleeting alterations, while at other times minglings yielded larger and longer lasting cultural, political, and demographic changes. An alternative history of the American West alerts us then to possibilities that were occasionally realized, if infrequently stabilized, that were sometimes forgotten, and when remembered, often distorted through a historical lens. In an alternative based not on what might have been, what if, or what we wish had been, but on what was, what happened, conciliations did give way often to bitter ethnic cleansings and stormy racial conflicts. Still, the existence, and in many cases the persistence over several decades, of hospitable, inclusive relations, defying, as I say, what we take to be the norm, are worth studying. And alternative history requires us to determine how it was in these instances that people overcame their differences as opposed to being overcome by those differences. Why these moments occurred yet did not endure, and what the legacy of broken concord might teach us. An alternative history of the American West reminds us that even in dark times, conciliations do happen. Reconciliations, we learn from the example I gave, reconciliations, we learn, are possible. And those lessons, those historically informed lessons from that alternative history, change, I think, the answer that we might give to Rodney King's plea from an emphatic no. Did we all get along? Sometimes. Can we all get along? Maybe.